Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of this conference. It's been wonderful to hear all the speakers and learn so much about climate change and the net zero target. Our final panel is going to focus on markets and to what extent we can leverage the power of markets to reach the objective of net zero and what might be some of the constraints or limits of how far markets can help us here. We have a wonderful set of panelists with us today for this. Their bios are with you on the conference website. So in the interest of time, I will not go through their distinguished backgrounds, but just introduce them quickly. The format is going to be each panelist will spend about 15 minutes to give their opening remarks, and then we will open up for a broader question and answer engagement. And for the audience, please put your questions in the chat box, and I will forward them to the panelists. So with that, very pleased to have our first panelist, Christian Gollier. He's the professor of economics and executive director of Toulouse School of Economics. Christian.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I have 3 slides, so if you allow me to share them, it would be better. Thank you very much. So let me start with a simple fact showing that price signals work. Here is a simple example where I compare the efficiency of cars in Europe and in the US over the last 30 years. Well, I'm sorry, I'm a little short on the last few years, but you see that the efficiency of European car is basically much better than in the US, and that's probably due to the very different price level of gasoline at the pump. So you see, currently, if I remember correctly, the price of gasoline in the US is something like 92 euro cents per liter, whereas it is basically the double in France. It's 1.8 euros per liter, so basically the double. And you see the consequences that in Europe, the cars are much more efficient, much larger number of kilometers run by liters used. So that's just an illustration of the importance of prices in the way of life, and that's true for gasoline, but it's also true for almost everything. We know that there is a price elasticity of demand, which is not zero. So the idea to use carbon price to drive behavior comes from this observation, and it also comes from the observation that climate change and carbon emission exercise an externality to others, and to redress the incentives. Carbon pricing is a tool to align these myriads of private interests with the common good, imposing a carbon price equaling to the climate damage induce people to behave as if the climate damages would be on their shoulder rather than on future generation. And so that's generate, that restore efficiency, market efficiency, or allocation of resources efficient in the economy. So carbon pricing with no exemption, uniform, is a simple mechanism. It's lobby-proof, and it's, as we know, least cost efficiency. That is, if you fix an objective in terms of, for example, intertemporal carbon budget, carbon pricing will generate this objective at the minimum impact of purchasing power for the citizens. So it's very important to realize that, at least under some condition. It works, as I just explained on the previous slide, but also, imposing carbon price has been very useful, for example, in the UK, to completely eliminate coal from the electricity mix there. And we know that coal is the most the most polluting source of fuel to produce electricity. So carbon pricing in the UK has been very efficient doing that. So moreover, we know that most other carbon pricing mechanisms, other mechanisms to induce people to reduce their emission are less efficient. For example, we know that subsidies to retrofit apartment or imposing norm for more efficient cars, that generates rebound effects. That is, when you retrofit your apartment with public subsidies, you will increase the average temperature in your apartment rather than to reduce the electricity or the fuel invoice. Other mechanisms like feed-in tariffs or norms or bans are rather inoperant policy, are based are not based, I should say, on policy evaluation that check that those mechanisms generate actions that are least cost compared to the other actions to reduce emissions. So at least if we don't use a price signal, we should use a mechanism to evaluate the myriad of micro climate policies to make sure that those policies attain the objective at minimum cost for the citizens. And that's clearly not the case. That's not the case in France, that's not the case in Europe, and I'm sure it's not the case in the US, as has been shown by many different papers in our profession over the last 20 years. Moreover, compared to other policies, carbon pricing allow us to use a carbon revenue, a fiscal revenue extracted from the carbon tax or from selling carbon permits on ETS market, and those revenues can be used to make the policy, the climate policies progressive rather than regressive. We know that in Europe and in the US, that the income elasticity of the demand for energy is smaller than one. That implies that imposing a larger price to energy impose a larger burden for the poor than for the wealthy. That's, for example, completely clear when you impose a feed-in tariff on electricity, on solar electricity or windmills. These extra costs will be borne by the consumers of electricity through a tax, like in France or in many other countries, and this tax is paid by everyone. And because again, the income elasticity of the demand for electricity is smaller than one, this increased cost of electricity will be regressive. It will affect more the poor than the wealthy. The difference between feed-in tariff and a carbon tax is that this carbon tax can be used to compensate the poor or even overcompensate the poor. Whereas the feed-in tariff, the benefit of the feed-in tariff goes into the pocket of the people who have been able to install photovoltaic panels on their roof, typically households that are rather wealthy. You need to be to own your roof in order to make that investment, and the poor cannot do that because they are not homeowners. So you see, the typical critics to carbon pricing, that is it's regressive, should be made rather to other policies, since for carbon pricing you can compensate the poor, whereas you cannot do that for other policies. Of course, carbon pricing is, and I'm sure Mar will add a lot of things to that point, it's not sufficient. Carbon pricing is not sufficient to help resolving the myriad of inefficiency we face on our market economies. For example, green R&D generate other externalities that just generating reduction in the cost of green energy, and those externalities. There are knowledge externalities that need to be cared of, and that can be done by providing subsidies to green R&D. So carbon pricing provides some incentive for making green R&D, but it's not enough because of the extra positive externality generated by this improved knowledge that is available to everybody. So let me putting a value on CO2 is useful even if we do not price it. It's important to remind this. I mean, putting a value to carbon is critically important to make cost-benefit analysis. Even if you decline the idea, refuse the idea that we need to impose a carbon signal, a price signal to everybody, you still need to value carbon in order to do the cost-benefit analysis, in order to perform climate policy evaluation. So that's important to have in mind. And let us also keep in mind that carbon pricing can be done through, carbon tax, market for permits, but it's also required to impose carbon border adjustment in a world where different countries will implement different carbon price. Even some countries will not impose any carbon price. So, for example, currently the carbon price in Europe is above 90 euros per ton of CO2. In the US, it's much smaller. So Europe should impose carbon border adjustment to any goods coming from the US. I don't know, I'm not sure you like that, but that's we are currently discussing in Brussels through this Fit for 55 package. Last slide. So there is, however, an important issue, which is we do not only need a carbon price today, we also need a carbon price for the future. I mean, we know that most actions to decarbonize our economy will be long-term investment. Replace your car by an electric car, replace a coal power plant by windmills or solar panels. So that's our capital investment that may last, whose benefit may last for 20, 30, 40 years. Look at, for example, nuclear power plant who could live for 60 years now. So in order for an entrepreneur to determine whether she or he should invest in decarbonized technologies, those people do not need to know the carbon price today, but they need to know the carbon price for the next 30, 40, 60 years to come. And that is a problem because our instrument we have today to impose a carbon price on markets, those instruments are not very credible in the long run. Carbon tax, we have seen, for example, in France with the Yellow Vest movement, that Emmanuel Macron had to freeze the growing carbon price. It's now stuck at 44.6 euros per ton of CO2. It should have been around 80 euros per ton of CO2 in 2022 if it would not have been frozen in December 2018. So that's generate a problem of credibility if we want a state to be credible in order to impose a carbon tax in the long run, growing at a relatively large rate if we want to attain the objective of 2 degrees Celsius. The same thing happened, but in a different nature for ETS markets, for permits of emission. There is a lot of volatility. If you look at the European ETS market, you see it has been around 5 euros 4 years ago, and now it's above. Yesterday it went down because of the war, but it has been typically above 19 euros per ton of CO2 over the last 3 months. But so you see a lot of volatility there, and of course volatility is not good for credibility, for long-term credibility. So the absence of credibility probably imply a lot of uncertainty for the investor ready to invest in green technologies, and so there is a problem of whether we should reorganize the ETS market in order to generate more credibility or more predictability to the evolution of carbon price in the future. So there are 2 ways to do that. One possibility is to commit the EU, for example, for the EU to commit on the carbon price floor, and to commit on the predetermined rate at which it should grow over time. So that's one possibility. The other possibility that I've been proposing over the last 2 years is to remember we had a big credibility problem to fight inflation 30 years ago. The way we solve it is to delegate, to give a democratic mandate to an independent central bank, which would control the flow of money. Here, it would be similar. Let us propose to transfer a democratic mandate to an independent institution, the EU Carbon Central Bank, that would have the mandate to control the emissions of CO2 permit.
1 minute, please.
Yeah, I'm almost done. So this raised two questions. In particular, the carbon price floor raised a problem because it may be possible that if you determine this carbon price floor now and afterward you realize that you have strong green innovation that imply that at the end we don't need a large carbon price to decarbonize our economies. You will be forced to maintain a large carbon price that generate an inefficient allocation of efforts in the economy. So there is a tension between predictability and efficiency. And let me finish with the following claim. I claim that if we want to attain the objective of the 2 degrees Celsius, we need to impose immediately a carbon price around 150 euros per ton of CO2, and that should be increased by 4% per year in order to attain, in expectation, a carbon price of around 500 euros per ton of CO2 by the year 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Our next panelist is Regwan, and she is a professor of economics at Northwestern University. Over to you.
Your mic.
Now, thank you. Do you see this? No. What do you see? Do you see the slides? Yes. Okay. No. Do you see the slides?
Not right now.
No, we saw them, but then it disappeared.
No?
Yes.
Now we
yes.
see them.
Now, okay, great. Yeah, I have too big of a slide set, so I'm going to put the timer and probably fail, but I will try. So I will try to talk about some of the challenges with carbon prices. That's how we set it up. I think Christian described well some of the great properties of pricing. Basically, if you have universal coverage and it's consistent across sectors, geographies, and temporally, it can provide a great signal. It provides the adequate signal for the externalities, and it follows a polluter pays principle that should be kind of reasonable given all the mounting evidence that the damages from climate change are extremely serious. I guess I will talk about some of the challenges in thinking of this ideal market and what are some of the things that we might have to give up to when thinking about these problems. So I say universal coverage, sectoral, geographical, and temporal. What are some of the reasons that we might need to give up to this aspiration? So universal coverage comes with dangers, and it's what I call internal leaks. So if you put a sector in the market that's not very well monitored or where the emission reductions are kind of slightly sketchy, you might risk compromising the credibility of the whole market. This is particularly true when the market is determined, when the price is determined in equilibrium, as is the case in most of the cap and trade systems that we see today. So this is one challenge, this internal leak. And one example is what happened early in the EU market and also in California with the presence of kind of shady offsets that are really not clear offsets, but that depress market prices and undermine reductions in other sectors that might be easier to verify. So I claim that maybe universal coverage is not ideal and that sometimes it might be good to break the market into different parts. Another good example is negative emissions. As Europe tries to get to these net zero goals, they will try to come up with things that count as negative emissions, and it would be very favorable for them to include it in the market as to keep prices reasonable. And that could be an honest challenge if we think about the climate ambition, if these negative emissions are not real reductions. This happened somewhat in California. You can call it offset or negative emissions, but many forests that were awarded offsets have been burned since. Finally, including all sectors opens the door for a lot of lobbying, and lobbying in this scenario will tend to depress prices even more. So it might be good to include the sectors where you can get a reasonable, decent price, and then try to adopt other policies in other sectors, as otherwise it would be compromising too much the price signal. And this is something that I honestly see a lot in the US. There is a lot of push for federal carbon pricing in the US. But if it could be approved, the prices would be ridiculously low. So the price signal wouldn't really get anywhere close to where it should be, and that's kind of a challenge. I think it would still be a success because it would manage to put a price in there, but honestly, that price would do very little. So this is one challenge on this sectoral coverage, geographical coverage. Christian already talked about this, but it does lead to external leakage. And even though there are effective economic solutions, such as taxing consumption instead of production and adopting border adjustment mechanisms, these are not perfect and are subject to choices that can be challenged in court or in trade agreements. So it's kind of a bit difficult to deal with these leaks. And it might be easier for the EU to say, we will not accept any car with a certain level of a standard, as opposed to we will manage to tax the carbon footprint of every single car, which could be challenged in trade agreements. So that's kind of one issue. The EU has been trying to push carbon border adjustments, and honestly, it's imperfect, but they've been trying to do it for particular sectors. And as imperfect as it is, it might be easier than trying to do a catch-all, because a catch-all will probably get challenged. So that's kind of another challenge. On the temporal, I will not extend myself because Christian already covered it quite a bit, but I will mention bans as an alternative where you make it very clear in time when things will get banned. And this is what's happening a little bit with combustion engines in the European Union, although honestly the years that are being announced for those bans will make them virtually irrelevant, but I do think it does send a strong signal. Once a ban has been passed, it's maybe slightly harder to walk back on it because factories have been stopped and consumers have more or less transitioned. So it's kind of easier to stick. It seems to me it's easier to stick to your announcement than at a given price. You can always lower a little bit and get away with it. So this is kind of an alternative to prices that tends to seem very radical, but it tends to work a bit better with the public. Christian also mentioned this, that carbon markets are not particularly popular. And one thing that we did work on our report together for the president of France is to highlight based on some studies that not only it is regressive in the absence of rebates, but that people do not perceive them as progressive, even if you do very aggressive, progressive rebates. This is unfortunate. It's a matter of perceptions. It's really not true that carbon markets are aggressive with the proper rebates, with the proper kind of rebates, but there is a challenge that that people still find it unfair. I believe one issue with carbon markets in general is that the price can be extremely high and almost everyone cannot afford a given good except the 1%. And that's one thing that really tends to get people off their comfort zone. So people in some sense prefer that flying is forbidden as opposed to only the very rich can fly. I think as economists, we see a lot of value into some planes still being allowed to fly, but it doesn't work as well when it comes to the popular support. And these are challenges that I don't have solutions for, but it's kind of mentioning some of the things that we identified. I think drastic measures tend to be perceived as much more inefficient because they are much more hand-on. They are much more command and control. But I think sometimes we fail to recognize that many of these drastic measures, and I say drastic in quotes, are implied by the very high prices that we should see if we are to be consistent with our climate goals. So here I put a kind of a schedule of prices based on the most recent evidence. This is, I believe, focused on France or the European Union. I am now blanking, but you can see prices of 250 euros per ton in 2030 and 775 euros per ton in 250. Well, these kind of prices do make cars irrelevant. So, and do make natural gas heating at the home irrelevant. So we might consider a ban on these types of production functions highly inefficient, but it is truly implied by the kind of price path that we are suggesting. So I guess my final slide is kind of highlighting that these two narratives, carbon prices versus sectoral efforts, are much closer together than we seem to recognize. First of all, sectoral efforts are painted as popular and easy, but they might not be as popular at the proper scale. And this is, I think, a challenge that we do need to recognize. Sometimes we paint this transition as super smooth and super easy and all benefits, subsidies here, subsidies there. But as things scale, it's really not as clear. And we do need them to scale to stick to our targets. The carbon prices are much more explicit about that, and they go to very high numbers if you take a carbon budget approach. Sectoral efforts, and on the other hand, are also painted as too intrusive from the economics point of view, but I do think many of them are compatible with the suggested price path that we see. And then carbon prices in general are painted as evil, but to me, removing a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry should not be an evil move, even for those that hate prices in general. So I do think we need to do some rebranding around carbon prices and call it removing fuel subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies. More generally, I do think that instead of trying to pick the very best way in which to address climate, it's very obvious to me that we are falling short and that we will fall short. So unless things are ridiculously stupid as a policy, it seems to me that anything that can pass should probably just be embraced. This is maybe a bit of a too practical, pragmatic view on the situation here, but it seems to me again that we are so falling behind in what needs to get done, and that whatever we claim we will do, we are going to achieve maybe 10% of what we said. That anything that people like, I would kind of go for it, as long as it's not, again, completely stupid from a social or economic point of view. I would, from a variety of approaches, focus not on the most efficient, because many are efficient already at the current damages, but focus on those that can be done quickly and that have concrete reductions that are actually certain. I guess that's it. I had here a summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mar. We will get back to questions quickly, but before we do, we have our final panelist, Gernot Wagner from NYU. Gernot, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I think we have 10 minutes. I'll make 3 points, no slides. And let me just say right from the get-go, I agree with both of you, Christian and Mar. Okay, 3 points. So pricing works, right? We know that. This is the one law we have in economics: price up, quantity demanded down. These 2 examples where we've sort of demonstrated that it doesn't, CO2 isn't one of them. Yes, it works. Point 1. Point 2, pricing is not, and this is now where Christian is going to swallow hard, I hope, is not a tax, is not a cap and trade system, not only a tax, not only a cap and trade system, right? The very first carbon price we have ever seen was in 1306 England. King Edward I, his mom had asthma. He banned the burning of coal, sea coal, infinite price, death penalty for repeat offenders. Right, that was a carbon price. No, not for anything other than local public health reasons, of course. And one industrial revolution later, we see that this ban essentially doesn't work. But yes, it too was a price. What is the price in the British coal sector right now? It's infinity. We employed 1 million people, 5% of the British workforce in 1920 at the height of the English-British coal sector. Right now, it is fewer than 2,000 people. There are 2 coal plants still around. None of them is currently operating. Right, so the effective shadow price, sectoral shadow price, whatever the technical term, is as high as it was in 1306. Is that too high a price to pay? Well, it's not the most cost-effective approach. Sure, there is probably something slightly more cost-effective going across sectors, or not just slightly more, infinitely more cost effective to use the tight economic decision. Well, that's not the criteria. That's not the only criteria. Of course not, right? What is the right price per ton of CO2? Well, there is no single right price, right? Even if you start with the social cost of carbon calculation to calculate the optimal price, there is lots of uncertainty. There are lots of reasons to believe that there is no single price that is the right one. There are reasons to believe that the 800 euros that Germans have been paying for solar feed-in tariffs is very much in the ballpark of what the social cost of carbon tells us is appropriate. More importantly, and this of course is the political economy of it all, and my third point, right? Timing matters, context matters, politics matters. It's not lost on me that there's 3 of us with European accents talking about carbon pricing at a conference running on Eastern Standard Time. Of course, right? There are very, very good reasons why the average testimony that Christian gives in Brussels or the European Parliament when it comes to Fit for 55, and why ETS, the European emissions trading system, ought to be a core pillar, and why how we use the revenue of that system matters, and so on and so forth. Why that conversation there is different than when any one of us testifies in Washington or in a state capital here in this country, in the US, right? Meanwhile, even if, or maybe especially if, the ultimate goal is a carbon price, not because the price itself is the goal, right? But because the more expansive, the more all-encompassing, the more cost-effective the tool is, the more likely certain other things are going to fall in place. But even if that's the goal, there might be a very good reason to focus on other policies, possibly even first, right? Policy sequencing is a topic of study in political economy for good reason. I answered one question before from Michael Oppenheimer. He will recognize this paper from 5 or so years ago. Push renewables to spur carbon pricing. Right? Even if the ultimate goal is the price, you still ought to, one still ought to focus on many, many other policies. One quick anecdote, in fact, from across the Atlantic, running with my accent here. Austria passed the carbon tax. It finished the negotiations last October, October 3rd, on a Sunday morning. 72 hours after, Austria finished negotiations to subsidize public transit. It's called the climate ticket. Every Austrian can buy one for €3 a day for the annual fare, and you'll take all public transit in all of Austria, train, trams, buses, funiculars, everything, right, for the ticket, right? Now, okay, that was sort of, the Super Bowl of, and, lots of other things happening in Austrian politics at the time. And to be clear, the country is 8 million people. So, right, I'm sitting here in New York City. It's what happens in Austria matters about as much what the mayor in New York does. Still, Austria had been trying to do this for 30 years. The current president of Austria, who, by the way, has an econometrica publication to his name, tenured economist at the University of Vienna, Green Party politician before he entered politics. When he entered politics, he proposed a very formal carbon tax proposal, right? One of these things that the Citizens Climate Lobby would recognize, or the Bipartisan Climate Leadership Council would put on its website, and so on and so forth. He proposed that in 1998. It got shut down from both sides. His fellow Greens, on the one hand, sellout economists proposing a price, and of course, the rest of the political spectrum for all the obvious reasons too. Well, 24 years later, if I'm doing my math right, 23 years later in this case, basically that very same proposal passed. Carbon tax and dividend. There is a lump sum transfer back, sort of beautifully designed, if you will. The level, €30 per ton of CO2. A week before Austria finished negotiations, the CEO of Volkswagen called for €65 per ton of CO2. Now, he called it for that number in Germany. He couldn't care less what happens in Austria, right? Germany matters a bit more. That was part of the coalition negotiations there. Him trying to lobby, as one is wont of doing when you are the CEO of a major company. Now, are the €30 enough? Of course they are not, right? Clearly not. Below the European emissions trading system price, below the shadow prices of lots and lots of other policies, below what Volkswagen wants, below what ExxonMobil would like to see. Now, why in this country does ExxonMobil publicly lobby, quote unquote, quietly lobby, publicly support a $50 per ton of CO2 carbon tax? Because they're trying to shoot down policies that have a shadow price of more than $50 per ton of CO2, right? Any policy, whether it's a carbon tax, any more direct, cap and trade system, technocratic, anything, command and control, whatever it is, of course, it is all about lobbying, all about politics at the end of the day. The US has 30 plus state level renewable portfolio standards. They are just in the power sector. They are not a carbon tax, right? They are not the most cost effective thing to do. They have shadow prices of between $100 and $300 per ton of CO2. And yes, there are, right, fellow economists. I won't name any names now, but easily lookupable in this case, Googleable, sorry, who then write earnest papers that say, oh, and this is inefficient. It's not cost effective. The costs are too high. The appropriate response is to say, look, we don't know what the right price per ton of CO2 is. Nobody does. We have a range, and that's within the range. Beggars can't be choosers, or whatever little phrase you would like to add on at the end. Timing matters. Of course it does. And at the end of the day, it is all about how whichever proposal is going to withstand the political sausage making process, whichever proposal is going to withstand the narrow coalition government negotiations between the junior coalition partner, the Greens, and the senior coalition partner, the Conservatives, in the Austrian context or the German context right about now, or of course here in this country, how it plays in a Congress where the 50th vote on a $555 billion climate package is nominally a Democrat, but what do we make of all of this? Well, not to make too much of the whole crisis equals opportunity statement, phrase, but of course it is precisely about this, right? It's incumbent upon us to be ready with the kind of policy proposals that fit, can adjust it to work in whichever political context one can imagine. Just to give a sort of one last link here and the sense of the current political context of it all. It is amazing to me how there is not a single analysis that I've been able to find in the European context that talks about what happens to gas markets, electricity markets on the one hand, and of course carbon, climate, and anything related more specifically with what happens currently, which what we currently see. The entity charged with ensuring the stability of the European gas network does not model the scenario of all of Russian gas disappearing. It models what if the pipelines through Belarus fail? What if the pipelines through the Ukraine fail? What if Turkey disappears and Algeria and Liberia? It doesn't conceive of the possibility that, well, as of however many hours ago, seems to be very much a reality, a potential a possibility here. Meanwhile, the think tank based in Brussels focused on the other side doesn't conceive of the demand side measure that, by the way, we all went through in April of 2020 in response to maybe actively doing something based on what we are seeing on the ground right now in a democratic European nation, right? And yes, there's no way to get ready for every one of these scenarios. Well, or is there? And that's the context in which any sort of conversation like this, climate policy, carbon markets roll in the broader climate policy portfolio ought to be happening, especially, of course, on a day like today. So with that, looking forward to discussion.
Thanks, Gernot, and all the other panelists. So there's a theme here I want to touch upon as the first question. Carbon pricing works in theory, also in practice, if we can implement it. I think that's fair to say. There are political economy, of course, constraints to how far we can go on the carbon pricing front. And Mar in particular pointed out some alternatives we need to push on at the same time. Let me just ask a question, which is also related to a question from the audience, which is, when we think about those alternatives, how can we push levers that quicken perhaps technological adoption that helps us get to the ultimate objective a little bit quicker, and hence relieves perhaps some of the pressure that we might otherwise have to put on carbon pricing front? And in particular, the question concerns intellectual property. So is there something on the legal side, on sort of the mechanism design side, if you will, that people have proposed that we can think about as something facilitating faster adoption of technology? Now, again, there are trade-offs because you want to incentivize innovation. But at the same time, once it's there, we want this to spread as fast and as cheaply as possible. So if anyone can take on that question and that trade-off.
Well, maybe I can talk about it. Christian and I did write quite a bit about it in our joint report. I hope I represent our views well, Christian, but we did greatly emphasize the role for innovation and the need, not only intellectual property, that might not be the best emphasis, also just practical transfer of knowledge. So it would be a complete disaster if Africa were to develop energy based on fossil fuels when they have plenty of solar. So it's not just the intellectual property, but also helping deploy in the more practical ways, how to make this transition basically leapfrog fossil fuels altogether. So some things we highlighted is innovation tournaments, like the efforts we have seen with COVID, and that means throwing a lot of money to the problem, basically with innovation context, but maybe contrary to what we have seen with COVID, with a stated willingness of sharing the findings with everyone that wants to jump on board. So that we did emphasize a lot. Maybe the most controversial point we were making in the report is that, in our opinion, those innovation contests should not be focused on fossil fuel technologies. So private companies will have every incentive to work on carbon capture and sequestration, but in our opinion, public funds, or my opinion at least, and I think Christian was in agreement, public funds should target innovation in non-fossil fuel technologies, keeping also an eye on scalability of these options. So we do need a lot of work on lean batteries that are extremely lean in resources, like some of the developments we're seeing with rocks and micro beds, micro rocks and gravity, basically exploiting gravity instead of very fancy batteries, and see how we can deploy that at huge scale.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add anything? Gernot, Christian? Okay. So just to follow up on that, Mar, you mentioned the tournaments. There's a related idea that Michael Kramer, for example, mentioned with regard to vaccines, which is you take existing intellectual property and you use public funds to essentially buy them out, and then you make them free for everyone to use. Do you see room for that piece as well to add to the mix of what we can do to hasten the process?
Yeah, I definitely don't see any reason not to also advocate for that if there are any IP bottlenecks that are identified. Again, in my opinion, I don't think many African countries will not just suddenly develop the capacity to build these things from scratch. So IP might not be the real bottleneck, but wherever IP is the bottleneck, I would definitely support that kind of strategies. Yes, obviously without the rents being ridiculous, because then it leads to all sorts of backlash, but finding the right price. Yes.
Right. There's a question about sort of protecting tropical forests, which is related to, again, this broader idea of what we are trying to achieve here. And so there's a question of whether there are, again, focusing more on narrower kind of sectoral policies, perhaps. Are there smart policies we can think about protecting the forests in particular?
Yeah, so this might be that I wasn't clear in explaining. I didn't mean that we shouldn't have policies encouraging avoiding deforestation. I meant that they should not be mixed in the same market. My concern is that if they are mixed in the same market, then they are used as an excuse to claim that the market is working. But there should be extreme efforts into avoiding deforestation, but in my opinion, as separate efforts. And these efforts could even be framed as markets, but it would be a market for no deforestation. I do think satellite technologies are extremely powerful when thinking about how to monitor deforestation. And it seems to me, I am not an expert in this area, but I do know some people that are starting to work on this. The key seems to be how to send the money to the right person. So how to send the money to the person that can actually prevent the forest from deforesting. And that's a hard question, but monitoring that the forest is not deforested, that seems to be easier than before. It's just, who do you need to incentivize to make sure that that happens? And it is not obvious in many of these areas. I think it wouldn't even be obvious in Europe, for example, or the US, but in many of these countries, it's even harder to see who really has the property rights to make sure that doesn't happen.
The agroforestry sector is probably the most difficult to supervise. In particular, providing subsidies for preserving forests is probably not a good idea because of the additivity problem. The difficulty is also to observe emissions of CO2 by burning trees. We should impose the same price on carbon generated by burning trees, and that's difficult. Agriculture is also difficult because, you know, methane produced by cows. You know, it's very difficult to evaluate these things, and the only way to proceed, as we say in the Blanchard-Tirol report, is to tax meats, in particular beef. We know basically we know almost surely what's the emission generated by producing 1 kilogram of beef, and we should just tax the kilogram of beef based on this evaluation using the carbon price we have for other markets. But I agree that carbon pricing is more difficult in the agroforestry sector.
Christiane, let me come to you with this suggestion that you had of, like, you know, the price point that you suggested, 150 per tons of carbon dioxide. How feasible do you think it is on the political side, to the extent you've had a chance to converse with the political side? And relatedly, is there anything you would add on a kind of a mechanism design approach way, like Gernot mentioned the example of Austria? Like, can you think of combining this with some kind of dividend payout to the public of the pool of money that you might generate from imposing such a carbon tax? In general, can you think of ways that might make it more amenable politically to push for something like that?
What, you know, first problem, I mean, I'm fascinated by observing the politicians promising, you know, minus 55% reduction of emission by the year 2030, being very proud of that. And then when they come back home, talk to their experts, they realize that the implicit value of carbon to generate that outcome is very large. So, you know, the 150 euros per ton of CO2 that I suggest is based on the fact that if we want to attain to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius target, we need to, and maybe this target is too ambitious. But if we go to this cost efficiency approach of imposing a 2 degrees Celsius target, the implication is that the carbon price associated to the target is much larger than what is proposed by, for example, William Nordhaus, who optimize the target and get to a larger increase in average temperature on the Earth by the end of the century. So the difficulty here is that we have politicians making promises, but even forgetting about carbon pricing, ambitious target has an impact on purchasing power in one way or another, by taxing carbon or by offering feed-in tariff for people who produce green electricity that generate larger price, larger cost of energy. I mean, substituting coal, fuel and gas by other technologies, which are currently much more expensive, particularly given the problem of intermittency, imply that you need to make sacrifice. And the difficulty is that politicians do not really realize that having ambitious target imply imposing sacrifices to the citizens. And the reality of the value of carbon associated to the target just demonstrate that. So I have no answer to your question of how to organize, how to make that politically feasible or politically acceptable or socially acceptable. But the point is, we live in a society where people live in a dream. I mean, in in the fiction of a green transition where we will create millions of jobs, well paid, like your green, I mean, different politicians on the Hill in Washington are claiming that, going greener will be good for electrical invoice jobs, whereas the reality is completely different. And the consequence is it's almost impossible to make something politically or socially acceptable when you have the electors living in that world. I mean, for example, the Yellow Vest movement is a clear demonstration of that. In France, people realized that the people were told that the transition will be good for them, and when they realized that the price of the liters of gasoline at the pump would be 3 cents larger on January the 1st, they just said no. We disagree. So I have no answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Christian. Gernot, I want you to chime in here as well. I mean, let me ask you that easy question. I mean, if you were to become advisor to the next presidential candidate, so you have to suggest a policy that also wins the election, right? And that's sort of the constraint we are talking about, right? So I'm just trying to make it real, if you will. And let's make it the US, because the US has additional set of problems, as you very well know. What would you suggest? I've given you a very difficult role. I understand that, but what would you suggest?
Well, let's start with household health. Quite literally, right? So here's the induction stove right over there. You see the pot, right? Okay. It is fundamentally a better product. It doesn't kill your kids or cause them to get asthma as you cook, with 3/4 of the emissions of one of these gas stoves happening when it is turned off, and so on and so forth. Right. And yes, you can get the snazzy $5,000 one that features in Architectural Digest. Gwyneth is on the cover this time around, and she has one. So why is it bad for the rest of us? And you can get the $50 version at IKEA, which, by the way, is tiny enough to fit in the student apartment, and so on and so forth. Right. So this is, and by the way, no, this is not about getting off gas, right? Because most gas, or the gas used by, for home cooking, is a tiny, tiny fraction of, for heating and other uses, right? But there is the sort of move that, it makes common sense. It's good for you. Now, okay, why have we not seen this sort of switch happening already? Frankly, lots of reasons. Fossil gas lobbying Architectural Digest to do put gas stoves in the apartments that are being shown on the cover is certainly part of that, right? And so on and so forth. Okay, so point one, this is about your health. Right, it's about you. Point two, and I know Christian and I might disagree here slightly, but the current White House is doing a pretty darn good job emphasizing the jobs aspect of it all. Let me just give you a small example here from New York City. Local Law 97. Every building more than 25,000 square feet needs to decarbonize starting next year. By the way, one implementation is in fact a cap and trade system across buildings, minus 40% by 2030. There are not enough certified electricians, plumbers, roofers in this city to do that, to achieve that. Right now, okay, so one way to say that is, okay, and therefore we just can't do this, right? So there is no way, right? This is too ambitious. The other one is to say, wait, this is a full employment program here, right? Anyone who would like to do this, here's an opportunity. There's a law that tells us we need to make this happen. There are third-party companies coming in, right? The full service package sold to the co-op board, and so on and so forth, dealing with the regulator, with landmarks, and with everything else, right? So this is all about those opportunities. Or to put it sort of more macro level, yes, we talk a lot about negative climatic tipping points, my own bread and butter in many ways, trying to price these things and how bad things are going to get. This is all about the socioeconomic tipping points, the positive tipping points, right? It's about a presidential candidate coming in and saying, we will electrify the federal fleet, 625,000 vehicles. Right. Well, that candidate won the election. He is currently in office. Yes, of course, there are still stumbling blocks. But yes, there is a list of the unity coalition between John Kerry on the one hand and AOC on the other, coming up with 56 points that the administration can do without Congress, which even now is especially relevant. And no, they haven't checked off every single one of them. But yes, of course, right? That's what it is all about. Is there a carbon price part of this? Well, not at the federal level, right? Because that takes Congress. We tried the clean electricity standard. Even that failed, not getting to 50 votes even in the Senate. It's about health. It's about opportunity and jobs. And yes, of course, it is about the positive aspect of, frankly, getting the politics to work of it. Carbon price may well be a fantastic supporting mechanism, but of course it is precisely this, a supporting mechanism.
Thanks. Let me, in the last few minutes that we have, think of a flip problem, if you will, which is, let's imagine for some mechanism, whether it's carbon pricing or whether it's encouraging innovation, we are able to go in the right direction or start moving in the right direction in terms of how we are producing energy and how we are using energy. In that process, we are going to have a lot of legacy assets, which are now going to be non-profitable, but they are still sitting on someone's balance sheet, right? So you're all well aware of that, those legacy asset problems. The question that I have is, and there are proposals of how to deal with it, or if it is a serious problem. So that's basically my question. How do you see that issue? Do you think of on that good path, right, from a global perspective, that we are kind of now on the path to solving this issue, but it's going to create these legacy asset problems? Do you see that as a problem that we should also need to think about? And if you do think it's a problem, how do you think we should approach solving that particular problem? Anyone?
Yeah. Maybe I could start. I mean, this is the issue of stranded asset. When you increase the carbon price, or when you make the climate ambitious more, the quick climate target more ambitious, that implies that some of the allocated capital will have no more value. I think the climate change problem exists for more than 30 years now. We are aware of the problem for more than 30 years. That is, investors in particular were aware of that. And so that's their loss. You cannot win all the time. Sometimes you lose, and when 20 years ago you decided to invest in a coal power plant, you realize today that you are making loss with it, and the net value of the plant is negative. That's your problem. So I will not do anything associated to that. I will not subsidize the closing in Germany, in Poland, or in the US for coal power plant. However, there is an issue associated to jobs. We need to organize compensation for lost job in the carbon sector, the most carbonized sector, and in Europe we are doing that with the Just Transition Fund, with something like, it changed over time, it's something like 20 billion euros that will be used to compensate job loss in sectors where they will appear given the increased European ambition. And of course, this is an issue associated to acceptability, because every European country has a veto right. It was clearly necessary in order to have a chance to pass this Fit for 55 ambitious project. So we need the France which will not lose a lot by imposing a larger carbon price, because most of the electricity mix in France is already fully decarbonized, compared to Germany and Poland, where the increased carbon price will imply a large cost for the energy transition there, and we need to compensate them in order to make that acceptable at the European level.
So if I may follow up, Atif, so I agree very much with Christian, support the community, back the communities, but not the assets. I would make it even more radical, but backing the assets opens you up for ransom, basically. That's one point. The second point is, which I am extremely disappointed by the recent change in EU policy that names natural gas as green, because I think that's a huge mistake when it comes to stranded assets, because it's basically opening the door for new investment in natural gas, which is definitely not what we need in Europe, and it will be a problem. And the third is that even if we say let the assets fall, it's their problem, the politics don't look like this, and they will do everything in their power to prevent them from falling. I am starting some work. It's too early to share results, looking at the transition away from coal in the United States. And we do find some evidence that in the States that, but this is too speculative, so don't quote me on this yet. But there is already some mounting evidence that in the states that are regulated, where there is a regulatory process to guarantee a rate of return to coal power plants, well, coal power plants are exiting less, and they are taking kind of a bit of a let's play, how much is this gonna cost you? Going back to my first point, that this is very dangerous, because obviously if these stranded assets are gonna be safe, I'm gonna go myself and build a natural gas power plant tomorrow and see what I can get for it. So it is very dangerous, and we do see some of this already happening. So I do think, to me, a red line in policy, which they have already passed, is not to allow new investments in fossil fuels with public funds. In the US, it's a no-go because the US has plenty of fossil fuels, but in Europe, I thought that was a feasible policy, and it sounds like it's not even feasible in Europe.
Thank you. Gernot, do you have any final words on this question?
No, except to say that, right, it in many ways, right, all of the above is sort of has a very particular context, especially in the US political context, and I don't mean it in that way, if you know what it means. But all of the above in the policy context here, right, is very much, right, must be front and center here. Stranded assets, of course, right? Are we going to have financial companies which will, right, scream bloody murder, that there is going to be a policy that adversely affects their bottom line? Of course they will, right? So is this sort of this phrase, at the end of the day, there are three sources of money in this green transition. There's ratepayers, consumers, there is taxpayers, and there is shareholders, right? It's either somebody pays for a higher electricity price, the government picks up the tab, or companies, their balance, the bottom line is going to be affected. And of course, right, politically, it's going to be a balance between these three. There is no other way around it. And stranded, right, as yes, they should have known better, of course. Well, told you so doesn't make for policy, unless sometimes it does, right? Sometimes you can get the 60 votes or the 51% by shouting told you so and sticking it to the man as you stick it to CO2. Great, let's go for it. And sometimes it means paying off the stranded assets in order to get to the 60 votes or the 50 votes in the Senate or the 51%, right? And you know, there's no one size fits all strategy here. There is political context that matters a lot. Let's make some shareholders whole and then some, if it means getting to where we need to go on the climate policy front.
Thanks, Gernot, and thank you to all the panelists. We are unfortunately out of time. Let me also use this opportunity to close the conference. I've already thanked everyone who participated in planning this conference in the beginning yesterday, but let me just reiterate two people, Pallavi Nuka and Nancy Turco at the Julis-Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. They have been working diligently behind the scenes for a long time. So I just want to thank them once again. And thank you to all the panelists throughout this conference, the attendees for participating. All the presentations will be made available online. So you can share that with others who may not have been able to see it in person. So thank you again and wish everyone the very best.